The farmer's guests, it was supposed to be the road trip of a lifetime. Me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and my boyfriend Chris had been planning it for months. A cross-country drive from Ohio to California, hitting all the weird roadside attractions and national parks along the way. We were young, broke, and just dumb enough to think taking a shortcut through some back roads in the middle of Nebraska was a good idea. The GPS had glitched, and we ended up on this narrow, unpaved road that seemed to stretch forever, surrounded by nothing but cornfields and the occasional creepy barn. The sun was setting, casting this eerie orange glow over everything. And that's when the car just died. No warning, no weird noises, just silence. We were stranded, miles from anywhere, with no cell service. That's when he showed up. Out of nowhere, this farmer pulled up in an old, beat-up truck that looked like it hadn't been washed since the 80s. He introduced himself as Earl, said he owned the land we were on, and offered to help. At first, I was relieved. Earl seemed friendly enough. He had this folksy charm, with his overalls and straw hat, and a smile that was just a little too wide. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His eyes, maybe they were this pale, almost colorless blue, and they never seemed to blink. He insisted we come back to his farm for the night, said he'd fix the car in the morning. "Ain't safe out here after dark," he kept saying, his voice low and steady. We didn't have much of a choice, so we agreed. Looking back, I wish we'd just slept in the car at Earl's farm was unsettling. The house was this old, weathered thing with peeling paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. As we got out of the truck, I noticed the sheds, 3 of them, all padlocked with heavy chains. One of them had a faint, metallic smell wafting from it, and I swear I heard something shift inside like a scraping sound. Earl caught me staring and quickly said, "Just tools and old equipment. Nothing interesting," but the way he said it made my skin crawl. Inside the house, it wasn't much better. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, like wet earth or rotting wood. The walls were covered in old photos, but they were all of the farm, no people, no family, just the land over and over again. Dinner was awkward. Earl had made this huge pot of stew, but none of us had much of an appetite. He kept asking us questions, where we were from, where we were headed, how long we'd been on the road. At first, it seemed like small talk, but then he started getting specific. "You took the I-80 exit, didn't you? Saw your car earlier, thought you might be heading this way." My stomach dropped. How could he have seen us? We hadn't passed a single car for miles. Chris tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was uneasy too. Mia, who's usually the chatty one, was dead silent, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for an exit. And then, just as Earl was clearing the plates, I heard it, a faint ringing from another room. He excused himself to answer it, and that's when I decided to follow him that I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Earl would hear it. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and I could see him standing by an old rotary phone, his back to me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught bits of it. "Yeah, they're here. All 4 of... No, I don't suspect a thing. We'll handle it tonight." My blood turned to ice. Handle it? Handle what? I backed away slowly, my mind racing. When I got back to the kitchen, I grabbed Chris's arm and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." He looked at me like I was crazy, but the fear in my eyes must have convinced him. Mia and Jake were already on edge, and when I told them what I'd heard, Jake's face went pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling, but it wasn't that simple. Earl came back into the room, that same too wide smile plastered on his face. "Y'all ready to turn in? Got the guest rooms all set up for you." His tone was cheerful, but there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating. We didn't have a choice but to play along. He led us upstairs to a narrow hallway with 3 doors. "2 to a room," he said, handing us each a key. "Sleep tight now." The moment he left, we huddled together in one of the rooms, whispering frantically. Chris suggested we wait until Earl was asleep and then make a run for it, but Jake pointed out that we had no idea where we were or how to get back to the main road. And then there were the sheds. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. What was in those sheds? And why were they locked? We waited for what felt like hours, sitting in silence, straining to hear any movement downstairs. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, and every sound made us jump. Finally, when the clock on the nightstand read just past midnight, we decided it was time to go. Chris cracked the door open and peeked into the hallway. "Coast is clear," he whispered. We tiptoed down the stairs, avoiding the spots we knew would creak, and made it to the front door without a sound. But when Chris tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he hissed, panic creeping into his voice. Mia pulled out the key Earl had given her, but it didn't fit. "He locked us in," she said, her voice shaking. My stomach churned. This wasn't just odd. This was deliberate. We were about to try a window when we heard it. A low, rhythmic thudding coming from outside. It sounded like it was coming from one of the sheds. Jake pressed his face against the window, squinting into the darkness. "There's a light on," he whispered. "In the middle shed." My heart was in my throat as I joined him at the window. Sure enough, a faint yellow light flickered from under the shed door. And then we saw Earl. He was walking toward the shed, carrying something, a toolbox, maybe. But as he got closer, I realized it wasn't tools. It was a coil of rope and what looked like a saw. My breath caught in my chest. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." But before we could move, the floorboards behind us creaked. We froze. Slowly, we turned around. Earl was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at us with those pale, unblinking eyes. "Y'all shouldn't be up," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's dangerous out there at night." The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. Earl took a step closer, and we instinctively backed away, huddling together near the window. His smile was gone now, replaced by a cold, blank expression that sent chills down my spine. "You kids shouldn't be snooping around," he said, his voice low and steady. "Ain't nothing out there for you to see." My mind was racing. What was in that shed? What was he planning to do with that rope and saw? I could feel Chris's hand gripping mine, his palms sweaty and trembling. Mia was clutching Jake's arm, her eyes wide with terror. We were trapped, and Earl knew it. That he took another step forward, and that's when Jake snapped. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You can't keep us here." Earl didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. And then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. For a second, I thought he was going to unlock the door and let us go. But instead, he tossed the keys onto the floor in front of us. "Go ahead," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Try-ing." Chris lunged for the keys, fumbling to find the one that fit the lock. But none of them worked. Earl let out a low, humorless laugh. "Told ya," he said. "Ain't no way out of here less I say so." My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a farm. It was a prison. And we were the prisoners. Desperation took over. Chris grabbed a lamp from the side table and hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, Earl looked stunned. "Run!" Chris shouted, and we didn't hesitate. We scrambled through the broken window, ignoring the shards of glass cutting into our hands and legs. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. We sprinted across the yard, the sound of Earl's heavy footsteps close behind. "Get to the car," Jake yelled, but I already knew it was hopeless. The car was dead, and we were miles from anywhere. Still, we ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. That's when I saw the headlights. A truck was coming down the dirt road, its high beams cutting through the darkness. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck skidded to a stop, and a man jumped out, a sheriff's badge glinting on his chest. "What the hell's going on here?" he demanded, his hand resting on his holster. Earl froze, his face twisting into something between anger and fear. "These kids broke into my house," he said, his voice shaking. "I was just trying to protect my property." The sheriff looked at us, then back at Earl, his eyes narrowing. "That true?" he asked. "No," Mia shouted, tears streaming down her face. "He locked us in. He was going to hurt us." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "All right, everyone calm down. We're going to sort this out." Earl was arrested that night. The sheriff found enough evidence in the sheds to charge him with, well, let's just say it wasn't his first time doing something like this. We never found out what he had planned for us, and honestly, I don't think I want to know. The car was towed, and the sheriff drove us to the nearest town, where we called our families and tried to process what had happened. It's been years since that night, but I still have nightmares about Earl's pale, unblinking eyes and the sound of that shed door creaking open. We got lucky. If that sheriff hadn't shown up when he did, I don't think any of us would be here to tell this story. The watcher in the hallway IVE been working as a security guard at this abandoned office building for about 6 months now. It's not the most glamorous job, but pays the bills, and the graveyard shift is quiet, or at least it's supposed to be. The building is old, with flickering fluorescent lights and long, empty hallways that echo with every step. I usually don't mind the solitude, but lately, things have started to feel off. It started small, lights flickering in areas where they shouldn't, faint noises like footsteps when I knew I was the only one there, and doors creaking open on their own. At first, I chalked it up to the building being old and falling apart, but the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. One night, about a week ago, things took a turn. I was doing my usual rounds on the third floor when I heard a loud crash from one of the empty offices. My heart jumped, and I froze for a second before grabbing my flashlight and heading toward the noise. When I got there, the door was wide open, and inside was a man, disheveled, with wild eyes and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He was muttering to himself, something about cleaning up loose ends and how I needed to get out before it's too late. I tried to calm him down, thinking he was just a homeless guy who'd found his way in, but the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, sent a chill down my spine that I've been working the graveyard shift as a security guard at this old office building for about 6 months now. It's not exactly a dream job, but it's steady work, and most nights are uneventful. The building's been empty for years, ever since the company that owned it went under. It's one of those places that feels like it's stuck in time. Dusty desks, outdated computers, and walls covered in faded motivational posters. I don't mind the quiet, though. At least, I didn't until recently. A couple of weeks ago, I started noticing weird things during my rounds. Lights flickering in hallways I just checked, faint noises like someone walking behind me, and doors that would creak open on their own. I try to brush it off. Old buildings do weird things, right? But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Then, last Thursday, something happened that I still can't explain. I was on the third floor, doing my usual patrol, when I heard a loud thud coming from one of the offices. My first thought was that maybe a ceiling tile had fallen. It wouldn't be the first time. But when I got closer, I saw the door was slightly open, and inside was a man. He looked rough, messy hair, clothes that were way too big for him, and this wild look in his eyes. He was pacing back and forth, muttering something under his breath. When he saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks and said, "You shouldn't be here. They're still cleaning up loose ends." I tried to talk to him, ask him who he was and how he got in, but he just kept repeating the same thing over and over like a broken record. I figured he was probably homeless and mentally ill, but the way he said it, like he was warning me, made my skin crawl that I called in to my supervisor. But by the time backup arrived, the guy was gone. We searched the building top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. No broken windows, no unlocked doors, nothing. My supervisor said it was probably just some drifter who'd found a way in and got spooked when he saw me. I wanted to believe that, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. The way he looked at me, the things he said, it felt personal, like he wasn't just rambling. I tried to shake it off and finish my shift, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next night, I decided to do a little digging. During my break, I went through some old files I found in the security office. Most of it was just maintenance records and employee logs, but then I stumbled on something strange. A folder labeled Incident Reports 2003. Inside were a bunch of documents about some kind of scandal involving the company that used to own the building. There were mentions of embezzlement, cover-ups, and even a few names of employees who'd supposedly gone missing. I didn't have time to read everything, but one name stood out, a guy named Daniel Hargrove. The report said he'd been a mid-level manager who'd disappeared after raising concerns about the company's finances. I didn't know what to make of it, but it made me wonder if the guy I'd seen the night before was connected somehow. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I started paying closer attention during my rounds, especially on the third floor where I'd seen the man. That's when I noticed other things, small things, but enough to make my stomach turn. Papers scattered on desks that hadn't been touched in years, chairs pulled out like someone had been sitting in them, and this weird smell, like burnt plastic, that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I even started carrying a pocket knife with me, just in case. I know it sounds paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that building. Then, last night, it all came to a head. I was doing my final round before clocking out when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time, like someone was running toward me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and there he was, the same guy from before. He was standing at the end of the hallway, just staring at me. Before I could say anything, he shouted, "You're still here? I told you to leave." His voice was frantic, almost desperate. I froze, not sure what to do, and that's when the lights went out. Completely. I fumbled with my flashlight, but by the time I got it working, he was gone. I didn't stick around to look for him. I just ran that I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those wild eyes, that desperate expression. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? What did he want? And why did he keep warning me to leave? The next morning, I went back to the building before my shift to do some more digging. I found an old employee directory in the security office and looked up the name from the incident report, Daniel Hargrove. There was a photo next to his name, and my stomach dropped. It was him. The guy I'd seen in the building was Daniel Hargrove, or at least someone who looked exactly like him. But according to the records, he'd disappeared over 20 years ago that I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? Hey, I think I saw a ghost in my building. They'd laugh me out of the station. So I decided to keep it to myself and just get through my shift. But as soon as I stepped into the building that night, I felt it, this heavy, oppressive feeling like the air itself was warning me to turn back. I tried to shake it off, but the closer I got to the third floor, the worse it got. By the time I reached the hallway where I'd seen him, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. I didn't see him that night, but I heard him. His voice, faint but clear, echoing down the hallway. You're running out of time. That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my supervisor and told him I needed the night off. I didn't give him details, just said I wasn't feeling well. He sounded annoyed, but agreed to cover my shift. I went home, but I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about Daniel Hargrove, the incident reports, and the way he'd looked at me. I decided to do some research online, hoping to find more about the company and what had happened back then. It took a while, but I finally found an old news article from 2003. The headline made my blood run cold. Local businessman linked to embezzlement scandal goes missing. The article mentioned Daniel Hargrove by name and hinted that he might have been silenced for trying to expose the company's illegal activities. There were even rumors that his body had never been found. The next day, I went back to work, determined to confront whatever was happening. I brought a voice recorder with me, hoping to catch something, anything, that could prove I wasn't losing my mind. I didn't see Daniel that night, but I heard him again. This time, his voice was softer, almost pleading. They're still here. They're watching. I played the recording back later, and sure enough, his voice was there, clear as day. I don't know what to make of it. Was he trying to warn me about something? Or was he just a lost soul, trapped in that building, reliving whatever nightmare had happened to him? Either way, I couldn't keep working there. I quit the next day, that I thought that would be the end of it. I quit the job, avoided the building, and tried to move on. But a few days ago, something happened that made me realize it wasn't over. I was at home, sitting on my couch, when I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. There was static at first, and then a voice, his voice. You shouldn't have left, he said. They know you know. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding. I blocked the number, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, I keep seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, and I swear I hear footsteps behind me when I'm alone that I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to go back to that building to try and find answers, but I'm too scared. What if Daniel was right? What if there's something or someone still there cleaning up loose ends? I don't have proof of anything, just a voice recording and a gut feeling that something terrible happened in that building. The watcher next door, my family, and I moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood about 3 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start for us, my wife, our 6-year-old daughter, and me. We'd been living in a cramped apartment in the city, and the idea of having a backyard and a little more space felt like a dream come true. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first glance. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, and friendly waves from people watering their lawns. Our next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, was the first to welcome us. He showed up on our doorstep with a basket of muffins and a big smile, introducing himself as the neighborhood watchman. At the time, it felt nice to have someone so welcoming. But looking back, I should have noticed the way his eyes lingered a little too long on my daughter. At first, Mr. Grayson's friendliness seemed harmless. He'd stop by to chat whenever he saw us outside, offering unsolicited advice about the lawn or the best way to prune the bushes. He always had a story to tell, usually about how he'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and knew everything about everyone. But after a couple of weeks, his visits started to feel off. He'd show up unannounced, sometimes early in the morning, and just stand there on our porch, smiling like it was completely normal. One time, I caught him peering through our living room window while I was having breakfast. When I confronted him, he just chuckled and said he was checking on the new family. I laughed it off, but deep down it creeped me out. Things took a stranger turn when we started finding things on our porch. At first, it was small stuff, a jar of homemade jam, a potted plant, a handwritten note with gardening tips. My wife thought it was sweet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just neighborly kindness. The notes started getting weirder, though. One said, "Your roses need more sunlight. I can help you move them." Another read, "Your daughter's laugh is so lovely. It reminds me of my granddaughter." That one made my skin crawl. I didn't even know he had a granddaughter. I started keeping the curtains closed and avoiding him when I saw him outside. But he always seemed to find a way to insert himself into our day. He'd linger near our driveway when I left for work, or he'd be outside gardening whenever my wife took our daughter to school. Then, one evening, our dog, Max, went missing. Max was a golden retriever, the friendliest dog you could imagine, and he never wandered far from the house. We searched the neighborhood for hours, calling his name and asking neighbors if they'd seen him. No one had. I was about to give up when I noticed Mr. Grayson standing at the edge of his yard, watching us. He didn't say anything, just stood there with this weird half-smile on his face. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that night, I heard barking coming from his backyard. It was faint, but I was sure it was Max. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, my heart pounding as I approached his shed. The door was slightly ajar, and when I peeked inside, there he was, Max, locked in a cage, looking scared but unharmed. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront Mr. Grayson right then and there, but another part of me was too scared. Why would he take our dog? Was he trying to send some kind of message? I decided to get Max out first and deal with the rest later. I opened the cage, and Max bolted out, tail between his legs like he'd been through something traumatic. I took him home, trying to calm him down, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. My wife was furious when I told her, and we agreed to keep a closer eye on Mr. Grayson from then on. We started locking the doors at night, and even installed a security camera facing his house. But it didn't stop him. The next day, Mr. Grayson showed up at our door like nothing had happened. He had another basket. This time it was filled with cookies, and that same unsettling smile. I didn't invite him in, but he didn't seem to care. He just stood there, talking about how much he loved having us as neighbors, and how he hoped we'd stick around for a long time. His tone was friendly, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach turn. Before he left, he said something I'll never forget. "You know, it's important to keep an eye on your family. You never know what might happen in a neighborhood like this." I didn't respond, just shut the door and locked it behind him. That's when I knew we had to do something that we decided to call the police. But when they showed up, Mr. Grayson played the perfect innocent old man. He acted confused, even hurt. When they asked him about Max, "Why would I take their dog?" he said, his voice trembling like he was about to cry. "I love animals. I never do something like that." The officers seemed to believe him, and without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told us to call if anything else happened, but I could tell they thought we were overreacting. I felt helpless, like we were trapped in some kind of twisted game, and Mr. Grayson was always one step ahead. Things only got worse after that. We started noticing him more often, always watching us from his yard or his windows. He'd wave like it was nothing, but his smile never reached his eyes. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our house. I grabbed the flashlight and looked out the window, and there he was standing in our driveway, staring up at our bedroom window. I shouted at him to leave, and he just laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "Just checking on you," he called out before slowly walking back to his house. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about what he'd said about keeping an eye on our family, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. The breaking point came a few days later. My wife and I were in the kitchen when we heard a loud crash from the backyard. We ran outside and found our trash cans knocked over, garbage scattered everywhere. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw him, Mr. Grayson, standing at the edge of our property, holding a shovel. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with this blank expression. I shouted at him to leave, but he didn't move. Instead, he started walking toward us, slowly, like he was savoring the moment. My wife grabbed our daughter and ran inside, but I stood my ground, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Get off my property!" I yelled, my voice shaking. He stopped a few feet away, tilted his head, and said, "You don't belong here. None of you do." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police again, and this time I made sure they understood how serious it was. I showed them the security footage of him in our driveway, the notes he'd left, and told them about Max. They finally took me seriously and went to talk to him. When they searched his house, they found something that made my blood run cold. A room filled with photos. Photos of our house, our family, even our daughter playing in the backyard. There were notes, too, detailing our routines, our habits, even what time we usually went to bed. It was like he'd been studying us, planning something. The police arrested him on the spot, and we finally felt like we could breathe again. After Mr. Grayson was arrested, we learned more about his past. Turns out, he'd been involved in similar incidents in other neighborhoods, but nothing had ever stuck. He'd always played the harmless old man card, and people had dismissed his behavior as eccentricity. But this time, with the evidence we provided, they had enough to charge him with stalking and trespassing. He's in jail now, awaiting trial, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's watching us. I keep expecting to see him standing outside our window, or to find another note on our porch. It's like he's still there, even though I know he's locked up. We've thought about moving, but we've already put so much into this house, and our daughter loves her school. So for now, we're staying. We've added more security cameras, installed motion sensor lights, and even got a new dog, a big, protective German shepherd named Duke. But every time I see the empty house next door, I can't help but wonder if we'll ever really feel safe here. Mr. Grayson might be gone, but the memory of what he did and what he might have been planning still haunts me. I guess some scars don't heal, no matter how much time passes. And now, I can't help but wonder if I've become part of it. Every time my phone rings, I freeze, terrified it's him again. I don't know how this ends, or if it ever will. All I know is I should have listened to him when he told me to leave.